He moved into the neighborhood quietly, without any big introduction or welcome party. The house was clean, modest, and looked like every other house on the street. Nothing about it stood out. The man himself didn't stand out either. He was in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, with a calm face and a habit of keeping to himself. He didn't try to be friendly, but he wasn't rude. He waved when someone waved first. He nodded when spoken to. And that was it. The neighborhood was one of those planned communities where everything looked neat all the time. Lawns were trimmed the same way, mailboxes matched, and trash cans had to be brought in within a specific number of hours. A large sign at the entrance proudly announced that the area was managed by a homeowners association. Everyone just called it the HOA. Most people living there were used to the rules. Some liked them. Some complained quietly, but followed them anyway. And then there were a few people who took those rules very seriously. For them, the HOA wasn't just a group that handled maintenance. It was a source of power from the first week the man moved in. A few neighbors noticed things about him that didn't fit their idea of normal. He came and went at odd hours. Sometimes his lights were on late at night. Sometimes his driveway was empty for days, and then suddenly his car would be back, dusty like it had been driven far. He didn't have family visiting. No loud parties. No kids playing in the yard. Just quiet at first. People didn't think much of it. But one person did. The HOA president had lived in the neighborhood for many years. She knew every rule by heart and enjoyed reminding people of them. She saw herself as the protector of the community. In her mind, anything unusual was a threat. And the new man was unusual. She noticed his trash can one morning, still near the curb a little past the allowed time. She took a photo. Later that week, she noticed his grass was slightly higher than regulation length. Another photo. She sent him formal warning emails, written in stiff language, reminding him of the rules. The man read the emails and complied. He brought the trash can in earlier next time. He cut the grass. He didn't reply to the emails unless required. When he did, his responses were short and polite. That should have been the end of it. But for her it wasn't. She began to watch more closely. She drove by his house slowly. She noticed a plain car parked there sometimes. No company logo, no clear reason. She told herself she was just being careful. She told herself it was her responsibility. Soon, she started talking to other board members. She asked if they had noticed the man's schedule. She asked if anyone knew what he did for a living. No one really knew. Someone guessed he worked remote. Someone else thought maybe he was in security. No one cared much, but she cared. She started keeping a small folder on him. Printed emails, photos of his house, notes about dates and times. She told herself this was normal HOA business. Meanwhile, the man continued living his life quietly. He left early some mornings. He came home late some nights. Sometimes he worked from home. Sometimes he didn't. He spoke to neighbors only when needed. He followed the rules because it was easier than arguing. What no one knew was that he preferred it this way. Quiet meant focus. Routine meant control. And staying unnoticed had always been important to him. A month after he moved in, another notice arrived. This one was about parking. According to the HOA, his car had been parked in the same spot for too long. He read it, checked the rules, and realized he was technically allowed to park there. He replied with a short message, quoting the rule. That reply didn't go over well. For the first time, the HOA president felt challenged. Not loudly, not rudely, but clearly. She didn't like that. To her, rules were not meant to be questioned. They were meant to be enforced. She began to feel that the man was being difficult on purpose. That he was testing boundaries. That maybe he thought he was above the rules. She decided to escalate. Another letter followed, this time mentioning possible fines if compliance was not improved. The wording was vague. The accusations were broad. The man read it carefully. He could see the tone had changed. It wasn't about trash cans or grass anymore. It was about control. He didn't respond right away. Not because he was afraid, but because he was busy. His work often required his full attention, and this week was one of those weeks. When he finally did respond, he attached photos showing compliance. He kept the message calm and factual. That calmness only made things worse. The HOA president started to assume things. Why was he so calm? Why wasn't he defensive? Why didn't he try to explain himself more? In her mind, silence and calm meant guilt. She started asking neighbors questions directly. Did they see who visited him? Did they hear noises at night? Did they know what he did? Most neighbors shrugged. Some felt uncomfortable. A few started to feel suspicious simply because she kept bringing it up. Rumors started quietly. Nothing extreme. Just questions. Just doubts. The man noticed a change in the way people looked at him. Some stopped waving back. Some watched him a little too closely. He noticed, but he didn't react. He had seen this kind of behavior before, in different forms. In different places, he reminded himself to stay patient. One evening, as he returned home later than usual, he saw her standing near his driveway. Pretending to check something on her phone, she looked up as he parked. Their eyes met briefly. She smiled. But it wasn't a friendly smile. He nodded and walked inside. That night, she wrote another report. She convinced herself that she was protecting the neighborhood, that whatever she was feeling wasn't personal, that she was doing her duty. But deep down, it had become personal. The man, sitting alone in his quiet house, looked at the latest notice on his table. He sighed, not in anger, but in tired acceptance. He knew this pattern. He knew where it usually led. He considered his options. He could push back hard. He could involve lawyers. He could reveal things that would shut the situation down immediately. But he didn't. He chose to wait. Because sometimes, letting people believe they are in control makes their mistakes clearer when they finally overstep. And in this neighborhood, that line was getting very close. The next few weeks passed slowly. But something had clearly changed in the neighborhood. The rules were the same, the houses looked the same, and people still went about their daily routines. But the feeling was different. There was a quiet tension in the air. It's a kind that doesn't show itself openly, but can be felt. The man continued living the same way he always had. He left early some mornings and came back late on others. Some days he stayed home, working quietly inside. He didn't change his habits to please anyone, but he also didn't break any rules. Every small detail was taken care of. Trash cans were on time. Lawn was cut properly. No noise. No complaints that could be proven. Still, the notices didn't stop. This time, the messages became more formal and more frequent. They were no longer simple reminders. They sounded more like warnings. The words were carefully chosen, almost legal in tone, as if someone was trying to sound more powerful than they really were. One letter mentioned ongoing concerns. Another mentioned reported activity, and nothing was explained clearly. No exact rule was quoted. Just vague statements that made it seem like something serious was happening. The man read every message carefully. He noticed the pattern. When people don't have real authority, they often try to sound like they do. He saved everything. Emails, letters, printed notices left on his door. He kept them organized, not out of fear, but out of habit. His work had taught him that details mattered. Patterns mattered. Meanwhile, the HOA president was growing more confident. To her, the lack of strong reaction meant she was winning. She believed pressure worked best when applied slowly. She told herself she was being patient. She began walking the neighborhood more often. She told others she was checking compliance. In reality, she passed by his house again and again. She noted when his lights were on. She noted when his car wasn't there. She even wrote down license plate numbers of cars that parked near his home for short periods. Most of those cars didn't belong to visitors. They were work-related. But she didn't know that, and she didn't ask. Instead, she started sharing her concerns with the board in longer meetings. She suggested that the man might be running some kind of business from home. She said the traffic didn't feel normal. She said his schedule didn't make sense. Some board members were unsure. One of them asked if there was proof. Another suggested leaving him alone since there were no clear violations. She didn't like that answer. She reminded them that it was their responsibility to protect property values. She warned them about hidden risks. She spoke with confidence. And confidence can be convincing, even when it's based on assumptions. Soon, the board agreed to let her handle the situation. The man noticed that neighbors had started acting differently. A few crossed the street when he walked by. Some whispered when he passed. One neighbor asked him casually what kind of work he did. He smiled politely and gave a vague answer. He wasn't lying. He was just not explaining. One afternoon, found a notice taped to his door, claiming he had violated a rule about unauthorized home use. The notice demanded an explanation within a short time frame. He read it twice. This was new. He sat at his table and thought carefully before responding. He knew that once things moved in this direction, they rarely went back. Accusations, even weak ones, had a way of growing. He replied calmly, asking which rule he had violated and requesting evidence. He kept his tone respectful and clear. The reply he received was cold and dismissive. It didn't answer his questions. It simply repeated the demand. That was when he realized the situation was no longer about rules. It was about authority. The HOA president felt ignored. She felt challenged again. And this time, she decided words were no longer enough. She contacted local authorities, not with a clear accusation, but with a story. She claimed there was suspicious activity in the neighborhood. She said she was concerned about safety. She used careful language that made it sound urgent without making direct claims. To her, this was just another step, a way to scare him into compliance, a way to remind him that she had power. The man was unaware of this call. When two officers first drove slowly past his house one evening, he noticed the car, but he didn't react. He had seen police cars many times before, in many places, for many reasons. The next day, a neighbor mentioned seeing police around. The tone was curious, almost excited. The man nodded and went on with his day. The HOA president took that as confirmation that her plan was working. She felt validated. She began speaking more openly about the situation, hinting that something serious might be going on. Rumors grew louder. Someone said he was being investigated. Someone else said he was dangerous. None of it was true, but fear doesn't need truth to spread. The man noticed the shift clearly now. He could feel eyes on him. He could sense judgment. He stayed calm on the outside, but inside, he was becoming more alert. He knew this pattern too well. One evening, he received a message stating that the HOA would be conducting a compliance review of his property and expected his cooperation. He read the message slowly. This was the line. He didn't respond immediately. He sat quietly in his living room, thinking. He knew that if he allowed them to push further, things could escalate in unpredictable ways. At the same time, revealing too much too early could also create problems. He decided to keep doing what he had always done. Stay calm. Stay quiet. Stay within the rules. The next morning, he found someone standing across the street, holding a phone, clearly taking pictures of his house. It wasn't subtle anymore. He stepped outside and simply looked at them. The person looked away and pretended to be checking messages. The man didn't say a word. He went back inside. Later that day, another notice arrived. This one mentioned possible fines and further action if cooperation was not shown. He placed it with the others. By now, the HOA president felt completely justified. In her mind, silence meant resistance. Calm meant guilt. And guilt meant she was right. She didn't realize that she was building a record of her own actions. The man, meanwhile, had already made a quiet decision. If this continued, he would no longer stay in the background. Not out of anger, but out of necessity. He wasn't worried, but he was ready. And the people pushing this hardest had no idea how close they were to stepping into something they did not understand. By the time the third month arrived, the situation had crossed from uncomfortable into openly hostile. The man could feel it every time he stepped outside. The air felt heavier, like the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. People no longer pretended not to stare. Curtains moved. Phones appeared in hands when he walked past. Smiles were gone. He still followed every rule. That was the part no one seemed to care about anymore. Another envelope arrived one morning, thicker than the rest. It wasn't just a notice this time. It included printed screenshots, photos of his house, and a list of alleged concerns. Words like investigation, noncompliance, and legal options were used again and again. It was meant to intimidate. He sat at his kitchen table and read it slowly, one page at a time. He didn't rush. He didn't react. When he finished, he placed the papers neatly back into the envelope and added it to the growing stack. Outside, the HOA president was already telling her version of the story. She spoke with confidence to anyone who would listen. She said the situation was serious. She hinted that authorities were involved. She made it sound like she was protecting everyone from something dangerous. The more she talked, the more attention she received. And attention made her feel important. She requested an emergency board meeting. That meeting didn't include the man. It was about him, but not with him. During the meeting, she laid out her case. She spoke about patterns, behavior, schedules, and things that didn't add up. She showed photos and notes. She raised her voice when questioned. She accused those who hesitated of not caring about safety. Eventually, the board agreed to take. The next step, they would involve local law enforcement. Directly not because there was evidence, but because they believed pressure would finally force cooperation. The man found out 2 days later when a patrol car stopped in front of his house in the early evening. 2 officers stepped out calmly and approached his door. There were no raised voices, no flashing lights. Just a knock. He opened the door without hesitation. The officers explained they were responding to concerns reported by the HOA. They asked routine questions. They looked around briefly, careful not to cross any lines. The man answered politely. He didn't volunteer information. He didn't argue. The officers left without incident. To him, it was exactly what he expected to the HOA president. It wasn't enough. She wanted results. She wanted confirmation that she was right. When nothing happened after the police visit, she grew frustrated. In her mind, the system was moving too slowly. So she decided to take matters into her own hands. She began showing up unannounced. One afternoon, the man opened his door to find her standing there with a clipboard and another board member. She spoke firmly, announcing that they were there to conduct a compliance check. He stepped outside and closed the door behind him. He listened as she listed her demands. Access to certain areas, explanations for his schedule, clarification about his work. He responded calmly. He told her that any inspection required proper notice and that he was not required to share personal employment details. She didn't like that answer. Her voice grew sharper. She warned him about consequences. She spoke as if she had authority far beyond her position. He remained calm. That calmness felt insulting to her. She accused him of being uncooperative. She said his behavior was suspicious. She said she would document everything. He nodded and said she was free to document whatever she wished. As long as she stayed off his property, that was when she crossed another line. Later that evening, she sent out a mass email to the neighborhood. It didn't name him directly, but everyone knew who it was about. She warned residents to be alert. She suggested reporting anything unusual. She framed it as a community effort. Fear spread quickly. People started calling the HOA office. Some reported seeing him come home late. Some mentioned unfamiliar cars. One even claimed to have heard noises that were never proven. The man became aware of this when another officer showed up, this time asking more direct questions. Again, the interaction was calm. Again. Nothing came of it, but now the situation was changing. The HOA president interpreted the lack of action as resistance from the system. She convinced herself that stronger steps were needed. She spoke openly about detaining him until authorities could sort things out. She forgot one important thing. She had no such power. The breaking point came on a quiet afternoon. The man returned home to find Several HOA members gathered near his driveway. A police car was parked nearby. Neighbors stood at a distance, watching. The HOA president stepped forward, confident and loud. She announced that, due to repeated noncompliance and ongoing concerns, he was required to cooperate immediately. One of the officers looked. Uncomfortable, the man asked calmly, "What law he had broken?" There was no clear answer. The HOA president insisted that he'd be detained until further review. She spoke as if she were giving orders. The officer hesitated. The man raised one hand slightly, not in surrender. But to pause the situation, he spoke calmly. He asked if he could make a phone call. The request changed everything. The officer nodded. The man stepped aside, pulled out his phone, and made a quiet call. He spoke briefly. He gave a location. He said very little. Then he waited. The HOA president smirked, and this was another delay tactic. She had no idea what she had just triggered. Within minutes, the tone of the officers changed. A call came through on their radio. Instructions were given. Questions were asked. The man ended his call and calmly placed his phone back into his pocket. He looked at the HOA president, not with anger, but with a tired patience. She was still confident. That confidence wouldn't last, because the situation was no longer in her control. And for the first time since all of this began, the man didn't stay silent. He spoke just one sentence, and it was enough to make everyone stop. He said who he worked for. The effect was immediate. The officers straightened. The crowd grew quiet. The HOA president's face changed. She laughed nervously. Assuming it was a joke, it wasn't. The man didn't explain. Further, he didn't need to, because help was already on the way, and the people who thought they could control him were about to learn how badly they had misjudged the situation. For a few long seconds after he spoke, no one said anything. The street that was usually filled with small sounds like birds, cars in the distance, or people talking suddenly felt silent. Even the neighbors watching from afar seemed frozen in place. The officers looked at each other. One of them stepped slightly aside and spoke quietly into the radio again. His tone was different now. Careful. Respectful. The HOA president tried to laugh it off. She said it had to be a misunderstanding. She said people could claim anything these days. She tried to regain control by talking louder, by repeating her accusations, by acting as if she still had authority over the situation. But the shift had already happened. The officers were no longer listening to her the same way. One of them turned to her and asked her to step back and lower her voice. The request was calm but firm. She wasn't used to that. She hesitated, clearly offended, then stepped back a little. The man stood quietly near his driveway. His posture was relaxed, his hands visible, his expression neutral. He wasn't trying to intimidate anyone. He didn't need to. Another police car arrived. Then another. Neighbors whispered. Phones came out again, but this time the energy was different. This wasn't curiosity anymore. It was confusion. The HOA president's confidence began to crack. She started explaining herself quickly, talking about safety, rules, and community responsibility. Her words rushed together. She kept pointing toward the man, as if repeating the gesture would make her accusations real. An officer finally stopped her. He asked her to explain exactly what law she believed had been broken. She struggled. She talked about suspicion, about patterns, about feelings, about things that didn't sit right. The officer listened patiently, then asked again, slower this time. What law? She had no answer. Meanwhile, another officer approached the man and asked him a few quiet questions. He answered briefly. He showed identification, not in a dramatic way. Just enough the officer nodded and stepped away. A few minutes later, a vehicle pulled up that didn't look like the others. It wasn't marked the same way. Two people stepped out, calm and professional. They didn't rush. They didn't draw attention to themselves. But the officers on the scene, immediately took notice. The HOA president noticed too. Even though she didn't understand why, one of the newcomers spoke privately with the man. They exchanged a few words. Nothing loud. Nothing emotional. Then everything changed. The police officers regrouped. One of them addressed the HOA president directly. He explained that there had been no legal grounds for detaining the man. He explained that repeated false or exaggerated reports could lead to serious consequences. Her face went pale. She tried to interrupt, but was told firmly to stop. She was informed that her actions, including harassment, unauthorized surveillance, and misuse of authority, were now being documented. The board members who had been standing nearby suddenly found the ground very interesting. One quietly stepped away. Another avoided eye contact. The neighbors watching from a distance slowly began to understand that the story they had been hearing wasn't true. The man said very little throughout all of this. He didn't argue. He didn't celebrate. He didn't insult anyone. He simply stood there, calm and steady. That calmness now felt different to everyone watching. It wasn't suspicious anymore. It was controlled. The HOA president tried one last time to defend herself. She claimed she was just doing her job. She said she was acting in good faith. She said she felt threatened. The response she received was not what she expected. She was told that feeling threatened did not give her the right to threaten others. She was told that her role did not grant her law enforcement power. She was told that the situation would not be handled by the HOA anymore. Those words hit harder than any fine or warning ever. The crowd began to disperse slowly. Some neighbors looked embarrassed. Some looked angry, not at the man, but at themselves for believing the rumors. A few avoided looking at him altogether. The officers finished documenting the scene. They spoke briefly with the man one last time, thanked him for his cooperation, and left. The street returned to its usual quiet. But nothing felt the same. The HOA president stood there for a moment longer, frozen. Then she gathered her papers with shaking hands and walked away without saying another word. That evening, the man sat alone in his living room. The house was quiet again. He placed his phone on the table and took a deep breath. He hadn't wanted it to go this far, but he knew it had been inevitable. Later that night, an email went out to the entire neighborhood from the HOA board. It was short and carefully written. It stated that the situation had been misunderstood and that residents were reminded to respect privacy and boundaries. There was no apology, but the message was clear. The next day, things felt different. People waved again. Some nodded awkwardly. One neighbor quietly said they were sorry for assuming things. The man accepted it without comment. He returned to his routine. Early mornings, late nights, quiet days, but behind the scenes, the consequences were only beginning. Formal complaints were filed. Records were reviewed. Emails and photos were examined. The HOA president was asked questions she could not easily answer, and for the first time since she had taken that role, she realized something she had never considered before. Power, when misused, doesn't disappear, it turns back on the person who holds it. The man knew this. That was why he had waited, and why he had never raised his voice in the days that followed. The neighborhood slowly tried to return to normal. Cars still came and went. Lawns were still trimmed. Trash cans were still rolled out and pulled back in on time. On the surface, everything looked the same. But underneath, something had changed. People were quieter now. Not in a tense way, but in a thoughtful one. Conversations stopped when he walked by, not because of fear anymore, but because of embarrassment. Many realized how easily they had believed a story without proof. The man noticed it, but he didn't react. He had learned long ago that people often regret things silently. A few days after the incident, another email came from the HOA board. This one was different. It announced that the president was stepping down effective immediately. It said the board would be restructuring and reviewing its procedures. It used careful words, trying to sound neutral. Everyone understood what it really meant. The woman who had driven everything had lost her position. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, the way real consequences often happen. Soon after that, official letters began to arrive. Not to the man, but to the HOA. Requests for records. Requests for explanations. Requests that couldn't be ignored. The man was contacted as well, politely and professionally. He provided what was needed: emails, notices, photos, timelines. Nothing more than facts. That was enough. Some neighbors later heard that fines were issued. Others heard there were legal costs. The full details never became public, and the man never asked. He didn't need to. Justice, to him, wasn't about watching someone fall. It was about stopping harm. Weeks passed. The neighborhood slowly relaxed. New board members were quieter, more careful. Rules were still enforced, but without aggression. Notices became rare. Conversations became respectful. One evening, a neighbor approached him while he was checking his mail. The neighbor looked uncomfortable but determined. They apologized, not with excuses. Just an honest apology. The man nodded and thanked them. That was all. Another neighbor brought over a small plate of food one weekend. They didn't mention the past. They talked about the weather instead. Life moved on. The man continued his routine. Early mornings, late nights, long periods of quiet. Sometimes he was gone for days, sometimes weeks. When he was home, he kept to himself. That never changed. One afternoon, he sat on his back porch listening to the distant sounds of the neighborhood. Children laughing. A lawnmower starting up. A dog barking. It felt ordinary again. He thought briefly about how close things had come to going much worse. How easily authority could be misunderstood. How quickly fear could turn neighbors against someone they didn't understand. He didn't feel angry, just aware. People often thought power was loud, that it showed itself through control, threats, and attention. But real power, he knew, was quiet. It waited, it observed, and it stepped in only when necessary. He had never wanted to be seen as special. He had never wanted attention. That was why he chose this place in the first place. A quiet neighborhood, predictable routines. He almost smiled at the irony. Months later, new people moved into the neighborhood. They had no idea what had happened before. To them, he was just another quiet neighbor, and that was exactly how he preferred it. One evening, he received a message on his phone. Short, direct, work-related. He read it, stood up, and went inside. The next morning, his car was gone. The house sat quietly. Just like always, the lawn stayed trimmed. The trash can was brought in on time. Nothing about the house suggested the story it held. And that was the lesson no one ever forgot. You never really know who someone is by how quiet they are sometimes. The calmest person in the room is calm because they don't need to prove anything at all. After everything settled on the surface, a longer and quieter process began underneath. It did not come with flashing lights or raised voices. It came with emails, forms, interviews, and time. A lot of time, the man understood this phase well. In many ways, it was the part that mattered most. Public moments faded quickly, but records lasted. Patterns mattered more than emotions. And this was where truth usually became clear. He was contacted again, politely, with clear boundaries and respect. The tone was different from anything he had received before from anyone connected to the neighborhood. There were no assumptions, no pressure. Just questions asked carefully. He answered them the same way, simply, clearly, without extra detail. He provided timelines showing when the notices began, how often they increased, and how their language changed over time. He showed how vague warnings slowly turned into threats. He explained how rumors spread after mass messages were sent out. He did not speculate about motives. He stuck to what could be proven. He had learned long ago that facts speak louder when they are allowed to stand on their own. Others were contacted. 2 board members were asked about decision-making processes. Why certain actions were approved, why others were ignored, why no legal review was done before involving authorities. Some answered honestly. Some hesitated. Some claimed they were just following directions. That explanation did not carry as much weight as they hoped. Responsibility, it turned out, could not be passed around forever. The former HOA president tried to explain herself as well. She said she felt overwhelmed. She said she believed she was doing the right thing. She said fear clouded her judgment. Those statements were noted. They did not erase the record. The investigation was not loud, but it was thorough. It looked at patterns beyond just one person. Other residents were asked if they had experienced similar behavior in the past. Some had not to the same degree, but enough to establish a trend. Slowly, a bigger picture formed. The man was not the first target. He was just the one who did not break. That realization stayed with him. He thought about how many people might have complied out of fear. How many might have paid fines they didn't owe. How many might have changed their lives just to avoid conflict. It bothered him more than what had happened to him personally when asked if he wanted to pursue further action. He thought carefully before answering. He said he wanted one thing: change, not punishment for its own sake, not attention, not apologies broadcast to the world, just safeguards, clear limits, accountability. That answer surprised some people. It impressed others. Policies were reviewed. Language was rewritten. Training was required. Oversight was added where none had existed before. It took months. During that time, the neighborhood lived in an in-between state. Nothing dramatic happened, but people paid more attention to how they spoke to each other. Notices were double-checked before being sent. Decisions were discussed instead of assumed. The atmosphere softened. One evening, while walking, the man noticed something small but meaningful. A new sign had been placed near the community board. It explained residents' rights clearly. It listed contact information for independent mediation. It reminded everyone that the HOA was not law. Enforcement. He stopped for a moment and read it. Then he continued. Walking. Life outside the neighborhood continued as well. His work demanded focus again. Long hours, travel, quiet concentration. The kind of work where mistakes mattered and patience was essential. When he returned home, after longer absences, the house felt the same. Calm, neutral, unassuming, that mattered to him. Occasionally, someone new would ask him about the past. The story had become a quiet legend in the area, passed along carefully. Without exaggeration, he never told it himself. If asked directly, he kept it short. He said misunderstandings happen. That was all. Time passed. Seasons changed. The neighborhood aged a little. Like all places do, years later, someone else took on a leadership role within the HOA. This person approached things differently. They listened more. They asked questions. They respected boundaries. No one said it out loud, but everyone remembered why. The man watched all of this from a distance. He did not feel pride. He felt relief, because the best outcome was not proving someone wrong. It was making sure it didn't happen again. One night, sitting quietly inside his home, he thought about how easily situations like this could unfold anywhere. How ordinary environments could become hostile when fear met authority. How quickly labels replaced understanding, he reminded himself. Why he stayed calm, not because he was unaffected, but because calm gave him control, and control allowed truth to surface. In the end, nothing about him changed. He remained quiet. He remained private. He remained careful, and that was enough. The house continued to blend in. The street continued to look ordinary, but beneath that ordinary surface lived a reminder. Power should always be questioned, and silence should never be mistaken for weakness. Time has a way of softening sharp memories, but it doesn't erase lessons. Long after the neighborhood incident stopped being discussed openly, its effect could still be felt in small, quiet ways. The man noticed it first in how people spoke during HOA meetings. There was less shouting, less pointing fingers, more listening, more pauses before decisions. People asked questions instead of making assumptions. Rules were explained instead of enforced aggressively. It wasn't perfect, but it was different. For the man, life continued much the same. His work still took him away for long stretches. Sometimes weeks passed before he returned. Other times he was home more often, working quietly behind closed doors. He kept his routines simple. He liked it that way. When he did come back after long absences, the neighborhood felt familiar, but slightly calmer. People nodded instead of staring. A few waved. No one followed him with their phone anymore. No one pretended to check their mailbox just to watch him. That alone felt like progress. One afternoon, while walking through the neighborhood, he overheard two neighbors talking. They weren't talking about him directly, but about an issue with parking and how it should be handled. One of them said something that made him stop for a moment. They said, "We should make sure we're not crossing any lines. Remember what happened before?" The man kept walking. He didn't smile, but he felt something close to relief. That single sentence meant the experience hadn't been wasted. Not long after, the HOA introduced a new system for handling complaints. Everything had to be written clearly. No anonymous reports. No vague accusations. Every concern had to reference an actual rule, and residents had the right to respond before any action was taken. Some people complained about the extra steps. Most people didn't. The man watched this from the background. He wasn't involved in the process. He didn't volunteer opinions. He didn't attend meetings unless necessary. That was intentional. He had learned that change often worked best when the person who triggered it stepped aside. One evening, a neighbor knocked on his door. This neighbor had lived there for years and had once been one of the quiet observers during the worst of the situation. They stood awkwardly for a moment before speaking. They said they wanted to thank him. The man looked. Surprised, the neighbor explained that they had always felt uncomfortable with how things were run before, but didn't know how to speak up. Seeing what happened made them realize that silence had a cost. The man listened. Without interrupting, when the neighbor finished, he simply said he hoped things would stay better. That was all. After the door closed, he stood still for a moment. That conversation stayed with him longer than he expected. He thought about how many people live under rules created by others without questioning them. How often fear of standing out keeps people quiet. How easily authority becomes habit. He had seen this pattern in many forms. Throughout his life, this neighborhood was just a smaller version of a much larger truth. As months turned into another year, the incident faded further into the past. New families moved in. Children grew older. Some residents moved away to newcomers. The neighborhood was just another quiet place with rules and trimmed lawns. They had no idea what had happened before, and that was fine. The man preferred it that way. One late evening, he sat alone in his living room, lights low, listening to the soft hum of the house. Outside, the street was quiet. No cars passed. No voices carried. He reflected on how close things had come to changing his life in a way he didn't want. Not because he was afraid, but because exposure had consequences. Attention had weight. He had always believed that the best protection was preparation. That belief had served him well. Sometimes people assumed calm meant weakness. They assumed silence meant submission. They assumed privacy meant secrecy. He knew better. Calm was choice. Silence was discipline. Privacy was survival. He thought briefly about the woman who had caused all of it. He wondered what she had learned, if anything. He didn't wish harm on her. He didn't feel satisfaction in her loss of position. He only hoped she understood where she went wrong, because understanding mattered more than punishment. One afternoon, while returning from a long trip, he noticed something small but telling. The old HOA bulletin board had been replaced. The new one was clean, simple, and clear. It didn't use threatening language. It used neutral words. Rights and responsibilities were written. side by side. That balance hadn't existed before. He stood there for a moment, reading it carefully, then continued home. The house welcomed him back with its familiar quiet. He placed his bag down, poured a glass of water, and sat in moments like that. He appreciated how ordinary his life looked from the outside. That ordinariness was earned. Weeks later, during another routine absence, a small incident occurred in the neighborhood involving someone else. A disagreement over noise. Nothing serious. In the past, it might have turned into threats and warnings. This time, it didn't. Mediation was offered. Voices stayed calm. The issue was resolved. When the man heard about it later, he nodded to himself. This was the real ending. Not the confrontation, not the exposure, but the quiet correction that followed. He understood something very clearly now. Standing your ground doesn't always mean standing in front. Sometimes it means standing still, letting truth do the work as time passed. His presence in the neighborhood became almost invisible again. People no longer associated him with the incident. He was just the quiet neighbor who came and went, and that was perfect. Because the story was never about him. It was about boundaries, about power, about how easily fear can be mistaken for responsibility, and how easily authority can forget its limits. Late one night, he stepped outside and looked up at the sky. The stars were faint, but visible. The air was cool. Calm, he took a deep breath. Everything was exactly as it should be.